Alright, so we're going to go over starting to paint in Mudbox, and then after this we're going to go over spend some time with Substance Painter. So the fundamental differences between Substance and Mudbox is number one, Mudbox is not a it's not only painting, it's primarily a sculpting program that you can use to texture. And it's much easier to get into because it's very similar to Photoshop and it uses the shortcuts of Maya. But it allows me to actually sculpt and send out displacement maps and things like that really well that can be used. Displacement maps, bump maps, normal maps that can be used not only for film but for games. Also with other programs. So what are the drawbacks? The drawbacks are that it is still a little bit behind when it comes to the workflow of a lot of games right now with PBR. And that's where it's using roughness and metallic properties because it doesn't actually have those as options. It has similar. It has diffuse, specular, gloss, incandescence, opacity, bump map, normal map, and reflection mask. And with a little bit of tweaking and a little bit of help, you can actually convert those and use those as a basis for roughness and such, but it's not a pure transition. Okay, so it's really good if I'm going to be using the Maya standard or certain not using non-PBR materials, and then I could go in and just start building a more elaborate shader to compensate for that. But its limitation is it's not a pure translation straight into a PBR environment, or when you're using something like the AI standard surface, or if you're in Unreal or Unity and you're using a PBR material. So Substance is, which we'll be going over, is strictly a painting and map generating program. It does not let you do sculpting at all. That's not what it's built for. It's built to make really good textures and has a very robust way of doing it. So with that said, you can actually do a material that is more like, that will output like Mudbox, but its default is more of a PBR based material that actually calculates lighting, tries to calculate lighting in real world more accurately. Right? If I'm going to generate a normal map or a displacement or something like that in Substance, it'll do it based off of how I've textured it. Or if I have a high-res and a low-res version of the model that I bring into Substance to generate it, same as Mudbox, it's just that I can't create that high-res version inside of Substance. So going into Mudbox, to start to paint on a character, first you have to make sure that the character is actually UV mapped. So if I go to my little top left tab with this Roboto guy and click on the UV view, and actually let me click on my character just real quick, and now I'll go, let's see, let me select him. I'm going to go to my object list, human body. Oh, come on, where's the UVs? You're killing me. Of course, it's like calling me a liar right now. So let me, if for some reason it's not wanting to show, but it does exist, trust me. So if I actually go, let's start off first with painting on it, and then I'll show you how the UVs are. So when I click on the UV view, I should be seeing the UVs, even though they're not wanting to show up right now, but that's okay. For me to start painting on the character, just like if I were in Photoshop or in Substance Painter, I need to have paint layers. So if you go to the top right corner, you'll see there's layers, And then at the top to the left of that, there's Sculpt and Paint. So last week we went over Sculpt, which is like, oh, I'm sculpting directly on, you know, a character. But there's also the Paint, and you'll notice it's blank. And if I go at the bottom left and choose my Paint tools, and just select Paint and then go to Paint on them, this window is going to pop up because it's saying, hey, stupid head, you don't have any paint layers to paint on. So I can either create one just by clicking the paintbrush under the paint tools at the bottom left and then trying to paint on him, and or I could go to the paint layers and just click on the little new page icon to add a new paint layer. So right now this window, create new paint layer, popped up. And I could rename it later. I could name it now, and I could just say, okay, I'm going to call this one Skin Base. And I'm going to start off with a 2K texture, 2048. I like to use Targa files, and the first one we're going to paint on is the diffuse. That would be the diffuse color. So I'm in my paint layers at the top right. I chose my paintbrush at the bottom left under Paint Tools. I clicked on him to try and paint, and then it pops this up, and I'm just going to name it Skin Base, 2K size, Targa 8-bit, diffuse channel, and hit OK. And once I've done that, and it creates the diffuse, which you see it has a diffuse channel and a skin base, I can now paint onto this character. See that? Let me pause that, just make sure everybody's okay. So now I can paint directly onto the model. One of the other differences between this program and Substance, and one of the reasons that I like to sometimes start with a texture in here, but then I've just started to put it in my workflow that I run immediately into Substance Painter after I've got my base, because I do love painting in Mudbox, but for what I do, it's limiting. And the reason being is because right now I'm painting on the diffuse. You can only paint on one channel at a time in Mudbox. And what that means is that if I paint a color in, then I have to go and switch to a different map and paint the shininess or the specularity. Then I have to go to another map and paint the bump. Whereas in Substance Painter, I set all those parameters to the brush and it will paint simultaneously in all of them, which saves me a lot of time, right? So if I'm not going to spend a ton of time, but I just want you guys to see how to use this if you're painting in here. So I have my painting tools at the bottom left under Paint Tools, brush, projection, eyedropper, airbrush, all these different ones. And you'll notice that most of these are very reminiscent of Photoshop, right? They are from Photoshop. And that's one of the things I really love about painting in Mudbox, because if you're used to painting things in Photoshop, painting in here is pretty easy because you do a lot of the same things, right? I can change my brushes, I can change stamps, the edges, the intensity, variations of how it rotates, follows along a path. So if I'm painting on this character, and I'm imagining, whoops, hello, stop that. And I'm imagining that I am going to paint in layers, right? So I have his skin base, and then at some point I'm going to have another texture that is going to be his clothing base and the fabric. So I'll put the skin underneath, and then I'll put the clothing on top and so on, and just start layering it, right? So this is my skin base. I can either just paint where there's skin, or I could flood the whole character with that skin tone. And if I want to flood it, I'm over to the right. I'm going to change the color to something a little, whatever foundation color I wanted. Let's say sort of like a base, a medium pinkish color. Pinkish tan. I don't like too dark and I don't like too light, because if I hit in the middle, it allows me to actually be able to darken some areas and lighten some areas. and that gives me a much easier variant. If I start with like, oh, really hard dark color or really super bright light color, I can only go in one direction from there, right? So I like going for the middle, and then I'm going to scroll down and just say flood paint layer in my properties to the right. And that will flood this entire character now with that color. Now, you can't really notice it too much because I picked one that was similar, but what's happening is also because of the lighting that I'm using, I can go to my light presets at the bottom right corner and see if a different lighting scheme, when I click on these, gives me a better variation of what I want. Some of them will tend to blow out. This is what soft white looks like. This is Thriller. This is the Chapel default. And I can also, if I want to just create my own light system, I can. Right now the lighting is kind of changing based off of how I'm looking at the character. So the lighting is kind of tied to the camera. If I were to go into my object list under directional light and turn on shadows, do you see the shadows change based off of the angle I'm looking at him to a certain degree? So because the lighting is locked to a camera. So as I change the lighting or change the camera angle, the lighting changes based off of that. And that's why it might be a little, you know, a little off at times. But in either case, if this is my foundation lighting, like right here, and I want to start painting, let's go back to my paintbrush. And now I could start to go in, now that I have a foundation color, and I could start to paint in different variations. Now, depending on how much RAM and stuff you have and how fast your machine is, I will stock up with the layers. So I might have blemishes on one, makeup on another layer, scars on another layer, and so on, so I could just shut them off and on, do all that kind of stuff. So how would I go about that? First, ideally, you have a color palette that you're working off of. What that means, let me see if I could show you. Character color. Okay. There is character, face, skin. Okay, so this is sort of a skin color palette. Do you see this? So when I have a character and I'm looking at this, and you could see what these tones and colors are for base, highlights, and shadows. So when you have these, like you'll see a lot of, if you look at people who are like doing digital matte paintings, or they're painting a character or concept art, they'll have this color palette someplace that they can sample or save the swatches of what are the highlights of this character, what are the midtones, what's the midtone or the base, what are the darker colors of this character, and then that way you can keep it very consistent. You just keep sampling, and then oh, my blemishes are going to be this. Oh, my highlights, the fair part of their skin is going to be this. And then you go in, and you could do that with hair, you could do that with skin, you could do that with a lot of things, but does this make sense when you're actually seeing these? This is like your go-to, that if you've established a palette. And you can even grab, like if you're basing it off of a person, take a photo of them, put them in Photoshop, and sample some of the colors from different parts of their face turn those into swatches, and then that's what you go off of. And that's how you can keep it so that the range of color isn't all across the board and that it's more consistent and it looks good. Okay. So inside of here, do you notice in my color brush here, my color swatches, when I clicked on color, there's these little white boxes with an X. And what those are doing are saving colors I've created. So those are going to start to develop what my swatches are. What are my highlights, midtone, shadows, so I would put them in. So if I actually said, oh, you know what? I want the darker to be this. And the moment I paint, you see it pops it into there. And then I say, oh, and I want the fair parts to be right about here. And now I've got those lined up, and I can just toggle switching between them. See that? Yeah.
Like in Photoshop, because like there's like presets like the colors too for like different hues that go together.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have that too in Mudbox?
You pretty much kind of lay it out yourself. I mean, here's the swatches. Like you can choose color palettes down here, and they have default, and you can load different ones. So a lot of times, like if we go, not preset materials, where are you? Usually I personally just make them myself when I need to. But you can actually create your own palette and then save it. Or you can actually go online and download some of them and say, oh, here's the palette that they used, and just start working with that. So it really just depends. And it's kind of funny because you also have this. In the color wheel, you also can bring in an image. So remember that what I told you about, like, oh, I bring in a picture of somebody that I'm basing it off of. I could drop it into here and then sample from different parts of the skin right in there. So it does have a lot of features to it. It just, you kind of customize it to how you want to do it. I've also seen people in Mudbox make a plane and then just put the colors on there in the plane so they could just immediately sample without digging and just jump to that one plane that has, it's like their little painting palette that's right there, and just sample immediately from it. But yeah, you can customize to that. So as I pick something, and like let's say this one's going to be a little bit darker, a little bit red or something like that. Now what you'll notice, so the letter B as in boy, left mouse button changes the scale and the size of the brush. The letter M as in Mary, left mouse button changes the strength of the brush. The longer the line coming out of it, the more intense the brush. Now, just painting, like if I go in right now, do you see I'm painting this in? And what I might do actually before I start really seriously painting is I'm going to actually go in and I'm going to take away the shine so it's not distracting me. So to do that, I'm going to go to the default material, or I'm just going to right click on this guy, say, so it has a brand new material, not the default, assign new material, Mudbox material. And specular, I'm just going to change that to a black. Say I took the specular away. Glossiness, you can see if I put that on, if there's specular on top of it, it would actually give it to me, but it's already a black. Whoops, hello. Yeah, I forgot about that. Didn't want it that dark. Stop that. There we are. Okay, that'll work. So I just kind of took that out of it so it's not like super uber ridiculously shiny. And now if I actually paint, oops. Of course, that's what you want to do before. Like I created a brand new material now, so now I have to recreate that one. Skin base. And now I'll just flood it with that mid-tone again. There we go.
There's nothing negative about making tons and tons of layers, is there?
The only negative that you have from making tons of layers is the capacity of your computer that you're working on, because it takes up more memory to do it. Just like in Photoshop. You reach a point, or Maya for that matter, you reach a point where you've maxed out your RAM, whether it's video card or internal RAM. You have to do a lot to do that, but you also have to factor in, I'm working in a 2K texture, so for everything I do, if there's a 2K texture, that's actually going to, you know, it's going to be up there. So you just, there we go, that's not bad, I like that. There we go. Alrighty. There we go. So I've got this down. Now I'm going to go in, and if I start to paint, instead of going like this, let me crank that up so you can see it, where I'm darkening it like that, because that doesn't look very natural, does it?
Looks like he's blushing.
Yeah. And I think I might actually, you know, I'll start him off just a little bit lighter just so we can see it a little easier. There we go. So now when I go in, Gesundheit, and we go in like this, the way that you want to start to build it up is by using stamps. So I'm going to choose the paintbrush, and then on the bottom right, let me close my color palette, where there's stamps, I can either bring in my own stamp, or I can choose one of the ones they have. And I like something that's a little cloudy, sort of like this one here, which is a cliff face. And if I do this one, do you see how it's splotchy like that? That's going to be a little more realistic. It's just too heavy. So I want to tone it down, and I want to make sure in my brush settings that I'm randomizing them. So you see there's an option, if you look up right here, where I can randomize my settings, and what it's saying is, how do you want to randomize it? Do you want to randomize its rotation of the stamp, so it's not always like going straight up and down? Its scale, you know, or basically it's a horizontal position, vertical position, scale, and contrast. So sometimes some of them are going to be harsher than others. So all of these kind of vary things up. So now if I go in, and I'll crank it up a little bit higher, I start to build up, and I make sure I'm mirroring on the X. And you see how I can actually start to get a lot more of a variation, and just to start to vary some things up and break up the skin a little bit. The thing that people make the mistake on is they try to go in and just do everything in one stroke because they just don't have the time. You know, I just want to do it quick. It's like quick, quick, quick. It's like, no, you kind of build up.
And this is all done with the stamp paint?
Right now, yeah. Because this is going to have blemishes, it's going to have little things like that. And depending on what palette I'm using, sometimes like if the character's really fair skinned, I might even have some pale blue grays, that kind of stuff going on, things like that. And especially if I'm going around the eyes, you know, different people, their eyes, some people are darker around the eyes, some people are, you know, have different tones. If you're really fair skinned, you might actually see more veins, you know, around the eyelids and stuff like that. So it really depends on the person, how old they are, what kind of skin they have, you know, all of those things, right? Now you can do, if you're trying to just get some variance, just like in Photoshop, you have a dodge and burn tool, right? That work essentially the same way. And I would also do the same thing where you can actually, there's the burn tool, and just like in Photoshop, you can apply it to highlights, midtones, or shadows. Right? So if I actually go in, and once again, I use a stamp, and also stamp spacing spreads things out, so I could actually choose something just to kind of vary things up, gesundheit. And then I could start to add a little bit of color in some of those areas and start to build up.
And of course, you can use the filter layer opacity to
Yeah, you can always tone it down. Right now I'm throwing stuff, ideally, like if you were putting these all on separate layers, then you could control them independently. Like, oh, my blemishes are on one layer, so I'm going to work on that.
This is essentially Photoshop.
Absolutely. And you just keep building up, and just so you can kind of see, I'm, you know, because I want to get to other things, I'm just trying to show you how the program works and then cut you loose on it. But if I go back to the paintbrush, and let's say I choose, this is an awesome one, so let's say I'm going to choose a lighter color that has maybe a little bit more of a kind of a palish blue to it. Really, really fair. And if I were lightening an area up, right, like, you know, right around the cheeks or something. And my stamp spacing is important because the stamp spacing is how far apart it's going to drop these stamps with each other. So to illustrate that, just so you can see, if I crank this up to 100%, do you see this? So with stamp spacing at 0, it's a straight line. With stamp spacing cranked up, you see that? It spatters it. So you want to have a little bit of spacing in there because it's going to give you a more natural breakup of stuff, you know. So if I go in here, I just want you to see this is kind of neat. If I started to like lighten up certain areas. Usually I like to do the fair area first and then the blemishes and stuff on top, but I'm just showing you techniques. But check this out. I'm going to choose, this one's kind of fun. I'm going to choose the leaf texture. And I want you to see what I'm going to do with this. Check it out. I'm going to choose a color that's like a blue-violet, like so. I'm going to tighten this brush up, but crank it up. Stamp, randomize, stamp spacing. Let me crank this up higher so you can see. A little bit higher. Increase that out. And more stamp spacing than that. So what you have is that you can actually get more like veins and stuff. You see that? In those areas. Now, of course, I don't want this overpowering, but cranking it up just enough, you could start to get that, like, oh, they're really, it's an older person, they're fair skinned. Let me tone that down a bit. And this will depend, there we go, that's better. I don't know if you could see that. Do you see that? Where you see these variations on the skin. And that's how you could start to get a more realistic start to look, you know, where their skin might be more translucent, where they're older or really, really fair skin. And then I make a new layer. And then on top of that, I'd pick something there might be those blemishes that I wanted. Do you see how the skin is starting to break up? Do you see that? So ideally, if you're doing your skin, what you want to do is you want to build up off of a, look at a reference image and then start to mimic what that reference is. Now the cool thing is any of these layers I can always go in, just like in Photoshop, I can right click, I could duplicate it, and with that duplicate I can also go in and adjust the color of that layer. So I could actually brighten it, do you see that, darken it. I can adjust the hue. Isn't that cool? So if it's not doing what I wanted, ooh, that's kind of neat right there. Or maybe a Roboto. And you notice because I put the blush on a separate layer, those, you see how it's like different on there? So you can do all these cool things just on the layer itself. I could even make it that maybe this guy, you know, oh, I'll do it like this. Let's find a good balance of what we want. Maybe right about here. Yeah, that might work out really well. So I take something like this, and I could even mask that out. Add a layer mask, just like in Photoshop. See, there's the mask. And then paint that texture into where I want. And that would be like, oh, this is the blemishes that I wanted. I just am going to paint in the mask instead and just paint it in where I want it. And the more you separate the layers, you definitely have more control. As I progress and I start to build that up and start to make adjustments to it, then you might find like, oh, let me tone this down a little bit. Oops, not the mask, the layer. Something like that. As my foundation. And I can always go in, use the smudge tool to smear things together, start to build up where the lips are. And then how I would separate, oh, I want to do, like, let's say I spent a lot of time and I tweaked it out, because you can do a lot of cool stuff with this, just with these brushes. If I made a brand new layer and then said, oh, I want to do, turn off randomize, but I do want it to follow a path. Oops. No stamp spacing. Oh, what the deuce? Oh, I think it's the UVs that need to be readjusted. That's why it's acting a little smudgy weird. But, oh yeah. Interesting. So this guy I'd have to go in and tweak out his UVs because I've sculpted him to the point where his UVs are not 100% accurate. That's why there's a little weird distortion in certain areas. The little strength right to the right of the layers. You just click on that and there's a little dial where you can go up and down. It should also be noted that there's material presets for the character that you can choose as well, depending on what you plan on doing with the character. Do you see these? Now it brings that shininess back, but it gives you an idea so that you can actually choose what you're going to be doing with the character. Actually, that's not bad. If I wanted to paint like, oh, I want to start painting his clothing or his helmet, then I'd make a brand new layer. Oh, here's a little trick. Watch this. Do you see I chose a material that's like chromey, but I don't want him chrome all over the place, right? Just where there's metal. So I choose that. I make a layer that is a reflection mask. And then that, you see, it makes a new channel, and I'm going to flood that reflection mask with black. And now I will go back and paint white, or, you know, something similar, to where I want it to be more metallic, like there, see? And what that's doing, do you see that? Where it's like where I'm painting it in? You see how it's shiny in those areas? Huh? You just select a material preset. Just click it. No, it will be for his entire whatever material that you're painting on. It will override certain things like if you're using the default specularity. But if I actually already have a specular channel and a reflective channel, it will acknowledge those and override what the default is. So, do you see this where it's like, oh, I'll just paint this in here. Let's crank that up a little bit higher. And I could, you notice how it's like kind of hard to get to the corners? So I can actually tighten my brush up and then choose a different fall off for my brush. See that? Where I can really see it. Now trying to get a sharp edge is difficult, so I'm going to use what's called steady stroke. It's in the properties, and I turn this on. And watch now what happens. So if I want to get a nice clean line, I click and drag with steady stroke on, and it follows the arrow. You see that? And that's going to make it a whole lot easier for me to get those nice edges that I might want. How did you mask the layer again? I flooded it with black. So you select the reflection mask, choose black, scroll down, flood paint layer. Because remember, this is only going to do whatever you actually have selected. So if I have the reflection mask, it's not going to flood the color or the specular or any other channel but the reflection mask if that's what I have selected. That's one of the fundamental differences between it and Substance, where I can do them together if I choose. And Control left mouse button, it inverts whatever you're doing. So in other words, left mouse button, you could see paints. You see that? Control left mouse button would invert it. So if I'm painting white, then it's going to be painting black. Okay.
What type of mask did you apply again? I apologize for asking so
It's
much.
okay, no. Reflection.
How do you... See, I see where mask is, but I don't see where...
Oh no, it's a new layer called so instead of a diffuse channel, you're painting a reflection mask channel.
Oh, okay, I see.
And the cool part is now if I go back to the diffuse and I have a layer and I start to paint on just that one and say, oh, you know what, I want this to be like a rich blue. Crank that puppy up, make it darker. Let's change the brush. Turn off steady stroke for right now. And I'll clean this up afterwards. I'm just doing this so you guys can see it, but check it out. Do you see that? So this would be my blue metallic, see that? Kind of surface. And then I would just go back afterwards and say, oops, you know what? I could just hit my erase button, paint erase, which is a tool, and just erase the color where I don't want it. See? Make it a whole lot cleaner, like that. See that though? Now, these are all like flat colors, but then if I really want to get crazy with it, then we could do stuff like this, where we pick a pattern that we're going to paint. Like, let's say on this character, I go back to him, and I make maybe either in the reflection mask if I want to, or the specular. And if I now paint a pattern, like let's say these dots, you see that? Or if I turn that down and just paint that in, watch when I get close. You could see a little shininess in there. Or I would paint in the specular, which will just be shine. Which means I'll see it where choose something like this. This is how you would add, like, oh, there's perspiration or shininess or oil to the skin. I use these dots. Do you see that, where we can get just this shininess going? Look at the skin right there. Do you see that? Like right on the, let me see if I can show you. Right on the cheek, you see? If I wanted to add pores, I would either sculpt them in or I would add a bump map. So when I add a bump map to this, and let's say I use the dots, so 50% gray is flat, white bumps up, black bumps down, but watch this, I'm going to make it a darker gray. Whoops, a little heavy. Tone that down a bit. Maybe he just shaved, so check it out. Crank that up a little bit more. You see that? So you see I'm exaggerating it so you can see it on the screen, but do you see the roughness on his skin now?
How do you take away material from the model?
You can either hide it all the way to the left to shut it off and on. You can tone down the opacity, or you could just delete it. Right-click, delete. Delete selected. Or with it selected, click on the little garbage can up here. Oh, you can also do projections of textures, whether it's something like this. So let's say I'm going to use the projection tool. That's next to the brush, right? And, oops, not stamp. We're going to choose a stencil. S right now. So I literally could bring in, if I'm painting from a person, I just have to make sure my projection tool is actually set to white. At least initially. This is going to be kind of funny, so watch this. He's not a perfect dimensional, you know, fit, but it'll be enough where I can actually show you what I mean. Do you see I'm projecting? Let me turn off this. So you literally, if you line things up properly, that's not going to be creepy at all. Let's turn on the X again. Do you see that? And then I'd have to fix his nose, which is a little bit difficult, but turn off that. Jakey's, stop that. So do you see I'm starting to texture this face on? I mean, it wasn't based off this character, so the matchup is not great, but it gives you the idea. And then I'd have a side picture that I would then project, or could project onto him. It's actually not too bad. Minus up there, but you get the idea. Do you see that? Oh, minus where the ear is, so I just keep lining it up. But here's the fun part of this one. I can grab like different pictures of people and use it as a stencil, but I can also recolor them. So let's say our friend is more of an alien, and I choose more of a bluish color to it. Let's make it lighter. You see that? So I can actually go in and say, no, I want him to be more blue. And depending on the intensity that I have, I could blend that in. See that? And then do the same for the front. Isn't that funny? So just so you can kind of see, like, you can actually, if you modeled off of a person and got their actual shape and had a picture, you could project it straight on to the actual character. Now, of course, he's all monked up right now, but you get the idea. As well as you could mask out and use any of these textures. And the way you would just bring them in is you would just go under Stencil or Stamp, click on that little arrow at the bottom when you have an image and say Add Stencil and choose it. And then it'll bring it in there. Just make sure in the stencil you're using projection. In the paintbrush, you're actually using it as a stamp. Because even though technically in my paintbrush I can use it as a stamp and a stencil, it's not going to come through the same way. So just be aware of which one you're using. But I just wanted to show you like the rough of just getting into this, of making the channels and painting and stuff like that, and just with the layers. And I want to spend a little more time on substance, because the same techniques I'm going to show you in there apply to here. Okay? It's just that it's a lot easier and you'll be able to get some really cool effects really quick with it. But that barbarian guy I was showing you guys, I originally painted him first inside of Mudbox. And then I brought him over into into here. So just keep that, you know, or brought him from here into Substance Painter afterwards. But I got the base texture and everything and spent time with that inside of here. Oh, the other thing that would be really important that I did not show, which I highly recommend when you guys are painting, and I probably should have did this first, check this out. Either by using your own skin, taking pictures or whatever, but let me show you this. This is kind of neat. These are skin textures, right? Like this. Now we have different types of skin that's all over, and there's some skin textures that are copyrighted, there are some that are free. You just have to kind of search for them. I know, yeah, you just start seeing a watermark pop up everywhere. It's just kind of funny. I know, and there it is. Well, it's funny. The picture of the skin is copyrighted, which I know. It's kind of like, really? But whatever. But if I have a texture, like let's say this of, you know, you find some skin textures, or you literally just take pictures of your own skin, right? Like this one could be a really good one, right? It's a little low res, that's the only problem. You typically want one that's a higher resolution. But once you actually have one and you say, okay, that one looks pretty good. Let me just show you what you can do with that, and that will help you out a lot. If it allows me to get in. Oh my God, you're killing me. So I'm going to save this one. I'll just plug it into my downloads for right now. And if I took a few, just so you can see, I'm just going to grab a couple just so you can see what it does. And I'm just going to say, oh, jumping Jiminy. Come back here. Large. Save image. Skin 2. Just so you can see, because these are pretty neat. Oh, look, there's one with hair. So we could use that as well. Skin, hair. So I've got these. Check this out. This is another thing that you can do that's really cool. So I'm going to make a brand new layer in my diffuse. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my stamps. Check this out. And I'm going to add those skins as stamps. Now they show up. Do you see them at the bottom right here? So check this out. So I choose one. There's my stamp. Make sure you're on paintbrush and make sure that it is white if you want the exact same color. And I'm going to crank this up so you can see it. And we want stamp spacing as well. Not as much, but right about there. Maybe a little bit more. Randomize that. That's better. Okay, check this out. I'm painting skin onto the character with variations because of that texture. Now, the real cool part about this is that I can also change that skin tone. So I can actually go in and say, oh, you know what, I want it to be a little more pink.
Would you run that as a stencil or a stamp?
A stamp. Now if I choose another one, there we go, look at that. Let me make that one a little lighter. Do you see I actually have the skin texture on it? I'm just coloring it. There we go. Look at that. Can you see? I'm cranking it up so you guys can see the difference. You see that? Where you can see the variations, the lights and the darks of the skin. And then, so using an actual skin texture, I can actually get that effect now. Absolutely. Here's the one with hair. So if I went over and started to do this with hair, I'm going to crank it up just so you can see. I'm going to increase the stamp spacing. And for this one, this texture is bigger, so I have to kind of make that a little bit larger. And now I'll tone down the stamp spacing. I actually have hair on there. But it all depends on what I'm trying to do and what I'm starting with. But do you see how I can actually get these different variations just from that? There's some UV issues that because I haven't UV mapped him since I sculpted him, so that's why they're stretching. But all in all, that's how you're getting these variations. Look at that. Can you see that? And if I took it a step further and did that in the bump map, let me tone it down. and I'm holding down Control so that the lighter areas are actually pushed in. Do you see I'm actually adding detail in the bump map to the skin? Can you see that? Now, once again, I'm cranking it up past higher than I actually would, just so you could see it on the projector. But imagine our little friend here was actually green, you know, like lizardy kind of. So just so you can kind of see, does that make sense? So you can actually, if you really want to get a good skin, sample some skin or find some skin textures and use those, and then start to tweak them out and then build up on them. And once you're all done in Mudbox and you're ready to send it out, then all you would do is you'd say, okay, I want to spit these textures out so I could bring it into whatever program. It's a little bit different in here than it is in whatchamacallit, in Substance. When I'm painting in Mudbox, if I save my character, wherever that file is, it's going to make a folder. And that folder is actually going to have all of my Mudbox files in it. But when I want ready to export, I could just go through it and say, oh, whichever ones I have turned on, right? Like if I had this and I go, oh, to diffuse, right-click, export channel merged, which would flatten all of those out. I could export them out layer by layer and then take it into another program if I want to tweak it out like Photoshop or even Substance and start to blend them there. I've never gone that route typically because it's just, I think once or twice I've done it for Photoshop. But I usually will say, okay, this is my base, and I want to now bring this, export this out merged, or export channel to PSD. And then that will send all of the channel out as, all these layers in here would be layers in Photoshop, and then I could tweak them out in there. So it gives me a lot of those options. I'd export them out, and then when I have the model, I'd bring them in to whatever program. Cool? Any questions? I just wanted to show you the tools and kind of turn you loose because I wanted to, like, Substance, I really want to show some of the features and benefits that you guys have. All good? No questions? Excellent. Then we can switch gears. Huh? Oh, no. And we can go to Substance. So if you guys downloaded Hans, ignore the TDR error thing that it will give you. And actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to save this first.